Hey, happy Friday, everybody. This is Chris Torrence coming in for another episode of the semi-related podcast here by Optum. A podcast, as many of you know that have tuned in the past. Semi-related was not a happenstance, but rather a play on words, as we like to have organic conversations with our guests, get to know about them personally, and then incorporate various topics related to the logistics space, transportation, et cetera. So without further ado, we have a really special guest today, a gentleman I've spoke with in the past one-on-one and gotten to know on some level over the last few months, and thought it would be a great opportunity to bring him on the podcast today to learn a little bit more about Mr. James Nissenberg. James, welcome, man. How you doing?
Great. I'm really happy to be here. Good to talk to you again, Chris.
Where are you tuning in today? Can I guess?
You can guess. It's not exactly the name of the company I currently work for, but I'm in Orange County, California.
Nice, man. A place that I've been to several times, and as the season incrementally starts to get a little cooler in my neck of the woods here in Chicago, where you're located certainly seems way more appealing as the winter months set in. So, James, as you mentioned, you are currently the Vice President of Logistics at Santa Monica Seafoods. James has a very impressive background for those starting with his education. Has been around some different organizations within the space for his career. And so, yeah, we want to kind of dive in that a little bit today and get to know James a little better. So, James, again, you don't have to go into extreme amounts of detail, but can you give it the audience that, those that may not know you, or maybe those that do, just a little bit of context and color around just your background and kind of as your earlier days at UCLA and a university called the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also known as MIT, obviously some of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. So kind of lead us through, maybe it's before that, during that, after that, the genesis of your background, man. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. I appreciate that. So my background is really focused in asset-based transportation. So, carriers, fleets, last mile operations, even terminals and infrastructure. I've sort of had a varied career and been able to work with various modes and various types of companies. It's had a great time, really. I started out a very long time ago. It's not on my LinkedIn because it's so long ago, but I was, I worked in airline management. I was a route planner for what was then America West Airlines.
Yeah.
The management team that I worked for took over U.S. Airways and then took over American Airlines. So, and in fact, the CEO of United Airlines, Scott Kirby, was my boss's boss way back when. So, but after being in aviation for about 4 years, I moved into logistics sort of by accident. I was working for, believe it or not, an airport consulting firm.
Okay.
They did everything related to airports, from, hey, we want to plan a new runway, to we want to optimize our concessions and, bring in as much revenue as we can. I started doing work for the associate that was focused on air cargo, and I found that I really liked it. And I sort of switched over at that point into doing sort of more of the cargo side of things and logistics versus the passenger side, which I had been doing. And then since then, really had both corporate and consulting roles, again, working in logistics consulting, and with a focus on asset-based transportation. Some of the companies that I worked for in consulting, just different consulting projects, CVS, Wegmans, markets on the East Coast.
No names.
Yeah. A company called Interline Brands, which is now the Home Depot Pro.
Okay.
Company called EcoServe, where we had a project optimizing their use of barges in Louisiana and Texas. So a lot of interesting work. Currently, I head logistics for Santa Monica Seafood, as you mentioned, which is a almost national, I'd say super regional food distributor, sales between $600 and $700 million.
Wow.
And I also serve on the benchmarking steering committee for National Private Truck Council. What that committee does is basically... Yeah. Sorry.
No, I just have to say I was at the NPTCO conference in Orlando, I believe, earlier this year. So, yeah.
Yes. They've moved it from Orlando, from Cincinnati permanently, I think. But they have an annual survey, sort of metric survey, which is super comprehensive and provides a lot of value. So I'm on the committee that sort of helps shape that survey, and then kind of looks at the results over with Tom Moore at the trade group as well, kind of saying, here's what we think this trend means and what this trend means, and before it's published for all our members and for the general public.
Very impressive. James, I also participate in a relatively new summit that I've been a part of here in Chicago called the Future Infrastructure Summit, Future of Infrastructure Summit, FIS, I think is the acronym. But I'd love to, off camera maybe, I would love to, your background in aviation, a lot of the airports are there, a lot of the airlines are there, and then everything from the DOT and the federal level of government is represented. So it just came to my mind. They're always asking me for interesting people that might be willing to join that conference. So I think you check all the boxes. So I'll keep that in mind.
Let's hook up afterwards.
In the next year. Yeah, for certain. So clearly a very diverse background. And again, I love that you're also involved in some of these trade orgs, and National Private Truck Council being one that for my current organization and anything related to optimization of assets, private fleets, that certainly hits the mark on many levels. James, you mentioned that, let's talk about last mile, final mile, however you want to phrase it. That's certainly a topic that I think started to call it the Amazon effect, right? But I've talked to a lot of executives and leaders within the space. And I think if there's one area, there's a few, but one that really seems to be at the forefront right now is is final mile, last mile. And as I talk to executives, I think we all agree that with the convenience factor of literally hitting a button on your phone and having packages show up right to your front door, I don't know that we'll ever go back completely to the brick and mortar, the more traditional means. Not saying that you can't have the omni-channel approach, but certainly last mile taking it's taking on much more of a discussion as of late, at least in my exposure. You are in the food service space and the grocery operations kind of environment. So can you describe, I think I have my understanding, but relative to what you're doing, and again, we're talking about perishable items here in food service and grocery operations. What are your thoughts in terms of give us some clarity around how that may differentiate from an Amazon, consumer packaged good delivery versus how the operation works in the grocery space? And then I'd love to hear, do you agree that seems to be a focal point, and maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I just think that's going to be really insightful for the audience that is curious to know specifically about last mile food service and grocery ops. So I'll love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, some of the obvious differences in last mile, sort of in the B2B space, whether it's food service or sort of doing business to business deliveries in general, versus home delivery is, on the one hand, B2B, you're delivering to a business. And when you deliver to a business, it usually requires physical contact with the customer, right? Whereas home delivery, they leave your package, they take a photo. Sometimes a signature is required, not always, not often. But when you deliver to a business, obviously there's physical contact with the customer. In addition, because of that contact, there's usually the pickup and delivery times are usually longer as well, right? I mean, a typical Amazon route, what do they do? 100 to 150 drops, maybe more,
Sounds right.
During a shift. I think it's almost impossible to do that on a B2B basis. I mean, probably UPS and FedEx have come close, especially when you can sort of do office buildings at one time. But, each stop takes longer than if you're doing residential or consumer deliveries.
Sure.
And then a couple other things are probably different. I mean, parking's probably more difficult. And when you're delivering on a residential street, you just park right in front and run to someone's porch. Maybe different with apartment buildings, but with businesses, sometimes there's certain restrictions. Sometimes you've got to have a dock to deliver. Sometimes they say you can't deliver before 7 a.m. because it's too noisy. And then another thing I think of is, crowdsourcing, right? So a lot of home delivery, retail home delivery is done via crowdsourcing. You've got the different companies out there that do that. I mean, Amazon, and then I'm not even sure who they all are now. Shipped.
Right. There's a bunch popping up. Yeah.
There's a bunch popping up. Axel Hire, I think.
Yeah.
I love that plug. I don't know anyone there.
They'll appreciate it. Yeah.
But on the B2B space and the food service space, you're much more likely to be using your own assets, right? So you're using your own fleet. You might be using couriers or 3PLs. You're generally not using crowdsourced deliveries for a number of reasons. You don't know who the person is, whether, even if they've been quote unquote certified. You're usually designing delivery routes. So you're putting 20 stops on a truck. You're not sort of one by one giving specific deliveries, on a crowdsourced basis.
Sure, sure.
So those are some of the differences I can think
Yeah.
of.
And I know you had the experience, so I think it's good. It's just very informative and educational for people that they don't always understand the differences between perishable and non-perishable and B2C, as you alluded to, it versus B2B. And again, we're talking about, food delivery and grocery operations, et cetera. But I mean, we're talking about a cold chain overall. So this extends well beyond just that final mile component. It has to, and I'm sure you have exposure from the genesis or the origin points all the way through, and may specifically focus on the logistics arm. But any other things? How does that? I think the audience is probably like, there's such the critical time factor, right? Because we're talking about perishables. So whether they're frozen, fresh, chilled, I've been in the temp control space as a shipper, know what those products are like, and seeing that if things don't operate smoothly, right, that can have a detrimental impact on the value of the product. We're talking again, and some of this stuff, especially what your current role is, we're talking about some pretty high end, some foods here, some seafood, right? So I haven't had any lobster tails delivered to me as of late, but I can only imagine when you're talking about serious quantities in the B2B world. James, what is the biggest challenge you see within that cold chain to date? Is it the final mile piece? Do you think there's opportunity further upstream in that? I'd love to hear kind of where's the opportunity to improve the efficiency in that entire cold chain model.
Right. So, maintaining the cold chain is vitally important, not just for product quality, but also for food safety. So, in both last mile and sort of wherever the product is being held or shipped, the top companies are using refrigerated equipment, right? So the trucks have reefer units. They maintain the right temperature. Sometimes it's a multi-temp truck where there's sort of different rooms for
the bulkheads. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So
yeah,
there's sort of a cooler for refrigerated. There's probably a frozen area. There's sometimes a dry area. It just sort of depends on who you're delivering to. So super important. One of the ways to make sure that you're maintaining the cold chain, on the last mile basis, and line haul too, really is, you've really got a couple of choices. One is to use the refrigerated equipment that you've installed on the truck, right? So might be a reefer from Carrier or Thermo King, being able to sort of read those temperatures and make sure that you're not violating what your food safety plan shows.
Well, let's talk about the systems, James, because if you're anywhere near my age, there was a time where we certainly didn't have the luxury of all these IoT sensors, ELDs, all this data flowing in there that can almost down to a very near, or if not real time level, get down to any fluctuations that may occur. So kind of in your exposure from early days to now, what are some of the systems and the technologies that you use that make this process a little more efficient, or at least allow the end user and the organizations using these tools and solutions to benefit from that?
Well, specifically on the cold chain side, there's several providers that have telematics equipment that will monitor things like temperature and humidity inside the box of the truck or the trailer. And then that's usually coupled with the ability to get alerts if the product goes out of temp. So we use, Santa Monica Seafood uses one of those systems. It's sort of a name brand system, and have the alert set up and try to make sure that we're maintaining the right temperature. You don't see it as much with the reefer units themselves. I think some of the reefer manufacturers, OEMs, were a little bit late to the game. So some of these telematics providers got to jump on them, but for sort of a second reading in the truck. But we use it extensively on our fleet, which is located in about 10 different cities. So yeah, that's the cold chain side, specifically on your own fleet. There's also sort of mobile temperature monitoring units, right? Sometimes they're called temp tails or time temperature recorders.
That's right.
That's progressed a bit. It used to be you just sort of throw one on, and then when the truck gets to the dock, the customer, which oftentimes is a big grocery chain, will
Sure.
walk it over to a computer, which I don't know how long that could take. I mean, for large DCs, it could take a long time, and then they'll sort of read it there and make sure it's okay. So that's improved a bit, where now that they can sort of wirelessly download that when the trailer gets there and see the information before even trying to offload the truck. So, my desire is that at some point they can read the telematics temperatures instead of even having these TTRs or temp tails, because they could be quite expensive. I mean, they run from probably $15 to $20 per unit, and oftentimes you're putting extra ones on the truck in case one misreads or doesn't work, or the battery goes out.
Insurance policy.
Yeah, right. Because you don't want a rejected load. So
we're talking high. And just to be clear, we're not talking about, I don't even want to guess what the cargo value is on some of this product on, even if it's not a full truckload, even in a smaller quantity, we're still talking about retail value. That's it's up there, I would assume.
That is correct.
Yeah.
It's perishable seafood and some related items that we do, like some high-end meats.
Yeah.
The value can be quite high. So you definitely don't want a rejected load. You don't want a partial rejected load.
No.
You want to make sure that everything goes smoothly with the delivery, and your customer's happy and that you can get paid.
Well, it's good to hear you talk about, I talked to some founders that are in the visibility space that are kind of taking more of, the future, in my opinion, and I think they're on the right track here, is, we started with the mandate, the LD mandate, which kind of changed the game for what visibility means, versus a EDI 214 batch update that's, okay, how real is this right now? But yeah, I think that the challenge was the unit economics, because it's not cheap. And I think those companies that are starting to kind of figure that part out and scale out, and started out with high value cargo and electronics and foods and things we've discussed today. But I'm hopeful, and I think the future is, at some point, there's always, and as a former employee in a visibility company here locally, that was the dark hole, the black hole would often be, and we're talking about global supply chains where, you may have some tracking inland, gets on the boat, and you see it, and all of a sudden it gets to the port stateside and it goes dark. It's got to be, there's a drayage move or an intermodal movement, and it's just, it got really ugly. And I think that the supply chain professionals at the higher levels are saying, I'm excited to see when we can get tracking, and not just location, but to your point, the temperature variations, and if there's shifts in product, because as you said, there's a huge cost to rejections and damages, et cetera. So I think I'm really excited to see that at some point we'll cross into this chasm of, when the unit economics continue to improve, where we can get tracking down to the pallet or skid level, and maybe even down to the individual box level at some point. Is that something that you're seeing now, James, or is this just still like we're still a ways out?
Well, I think it depends on the industry and the requirements for the industry. When I see tracking that has to get down to the individual case level or even unit level, it's usually something like in the healthcare space or pharmaceuticals. It's not necessarily food. That could get wildly expensive for every case of product to have its own tracker. But I do think it's out there, as you mentioned, Chris. I couldn't say whether, sort of that piece of it's growing or not, but I completely agree with you on the visibility. Beyond basic tracking, sort of knowing the quality and the characteristics of that your product has sort of been kept in a state that you want it to be kept in is super important. That originally with tracking and visibility, the whole point of it, in my view, was to make sure that the ETA is accurate, right? Yeah. When is this product going to arrive? Okay, great. It got to, as you mentioned, the port. It got to the Port of Savannah. Okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, usually you're going to put in like a pickup model or something. So, hey, our transit from our manufacturer in the Philippines to our warehouse in Georgia is 24 days. And it's 3 days from this event to this event, 4 days from this event, that type of thing. So that's one way in the past, I've sort of used visibility. I always chuckled a little bit. Sometimes you'll see your shipment. I don't want to name some of the big parcel carriers, but you'll track your shipment, or they'll send you something that says, "Oh, hey, it arrived. It shipped from this location. It arrived in Indianapolis. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Did the ETA change? I mean, I don't. That's fine. It could be next
It's an
door. When is
update.
it coming? Right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The intermediate points. Okay, I understand you're telling me you have the technology to track it, but what does it mean for when it's going to get to me? Right? That's the
Yeah.
important thing.
I think that's where visibility as a space now, and I think it saw its peak, in my opinion, at least the initial first movers saw tremendous success back in, I want to say, the 2016, 17, 18, pre-COVID. Now it's proliferated. And so I think these organizations are kind of in this position now of, to your earlier point, like, great, I can see breadcrumbs on a map. What now? What, right? I want more. How do I action that, right? And I think it ties
Right.
back into dynamic ETAs. How does that affect into just for the appointment scheduling, right? Because we know things don't always happen as planned. No secret there.
Yeah.
So how are, I like to think that these companies are evolving to say we're dynamically adjusting, because how many times do I go to a facility, a distribution center, any delivery location, and especially the larger ones, and you got a line of trucks at the gate check, and the guards out there, or maybe they're using kiosks now. I like to think automation's starting to take place, but yeah, there's always the guy that was supposed to be here at 8 a.m. He broke down or is stuck up somewhere, and the old way was, we got trucks here. It's like, yeah, but their appointment's not till 3 o'clock this afternoon. They got to sit, and I'm going, so you got guys on the dock just hanging out because the system is not reflecting what they're supposed to be doing. So I've always felt like that's just as with many things in supply chain logistics, it's broken. So I'm hopeful that we can start just incorporate a sense of logic and utilize this time wisely. And I think it improves the quality for the driver that has to spend time that's not really on the road, but just waiting, and the frustration that we hear about for the driver community. And then it just seems like there's still a lot of opportunity for improvement. And James, when you look at it, where do you see the biggest breakdown today in that process? And maybe it's visibility, maybe it's somewhere else. And in the flip side of that coin, if I'm giving James the magic wand within your core organization or just in general, what's the missing link today that you would incorporate if you had that authority and ability to implement something like in the near term?
Well, I could talk specifically about the last mile space.
Of course. Yeah.
So, we use various systems to manage our last mile operations, right? So obviously there's data in the ERP that we use in terms of, point systems. You've got sort of the routing and dispatch system. You've got your telematics system that we talked about before. You've got fleet administration. You don't hear much about that. How do you manage your fleet? So a lot of the software out there that says they do fleet administration or something like that is very tailored towards maintenance. But a lot of fleets out there are on full service leases, and it's up to the leasing company, like a Ryder or a Rush, to take care of preventative maintenance. So, maintenance per se is obviously we want our trucks to run, but it's not something that we're super focused on day to day. So how do we kind of keep track of the fleet, right? When did the lease start? When does it end? How many average miles are we putting on the truck? How long is the truck? How many pallets can it hold? You could come up with probably 40 or 50 different data fields.
Easy.
Yeah. And then also driver administration, right? I mean, that could be, in your HR system, or it could be, hopefully one day in more of a logistics system.
Yeah.
So, we're working with all these different systems, and it'd be great to have it all in one system, right?
The unification would be, I think everyone's holding their breath. Yes. Wait for that day.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not really what I see. With the exception of, here's a plug for Solera, which purchased Omnitrix, which purchased RoadNet a long time ago. They've tried to go to this. I don't know if it's still called Omnitrix One or something like that, but they're trying to unify a system. I don't really see anyone else doing that. Maybe Descartes. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, the bigger players. Yeah.
Yeah. But instead, what I see is a lot of new players in each of these specific sort of point spaces, right? You got a lot of new companies that you say they do routing and dispatch. You've got a lot of companies playing in the telematics space. You've got some big telematics players that continue to try to drive value out of that sort of telematics hardware and platform. But to me, they're not really thinking about unifying things in a way that, an operations director wants to see things, right? They don't want to deal with, I don't want my drivers to have to, when they're, focused on deliveries and interaction with the customer, I don't want them to have to go into 3 or 4 different apps on their phone, right?
Bingo. Bingo. And that's the interesting thing I've seen over my career as someone who spent some time in the TMS world where, fairly large enterprise grade TMS that every year, we would claim to do, workflow management aside, we do all these other peripheral solutions, including back office, freight pay and audit, some automation, some optimization, visibility. But the reality was we were workflow management. And I think the difference was back in those days, probably late 90s, early 2000s, it's interesting because the sales pitch was that we are a unified single pane of glass, one version of the truth, the source of truth. And I think it was kind of the conundrum is from a user experience, absolutely. The less apps I have to download or systems I have to toggle in and out and credentials and password. Yeah, I get it. That is cumbersome. The challenge is, and what happened when the venture capital started flowing in, and that's really more in the few recent years, we are seeing, to your point, these point solutions, niche players that are saying the TMSs claim to have all these really like robust solutions that cover the, end to end. But reality is they're just so massive in scale. And again, we're talking about really workflow, like core TMS functionality. They're never great in any one thing. And I think that as someone who's been in the optimization space for the last, say, 4 or 5 years, I look at that problem as very singular with its own multitude of dynamics and constraints and parameters. I can only imagine of a TMS, we've kind of alluded to some of these bigger ones. It's like, how do you guys even have time or the in-house resources to focus on that as a core competency? And I think the reason I bring that up is because there's it's again, that conundrum of I want it all on a unified platform, but also want best of breed of every niche point solution. Right. How do we make that happen, James?
I don't know. There's always that push-pull going on, and you talk to the IT team or the CIO at some of these larger companies. They could have 30 or 40 different software systems they're using. Some they've sourced, some are homegrown, and it's spaghetti. But
indeed,
I don't know from my perspective. So I think it depends on the company and the industry. How much of a very focused point solution you need versus sort of general functionality, right?
Sure.
So I think there's definitely companies that, hey, we don't need it to be excellent in every area. We just need it to be good. And it's more important to have that connected workflow. Then you're looking for that sort of single system.
Right.
If it's, quote unquote, mission critical to get specific aspects right, then maybe you are looking for a lot of point solutions. I think it just depends on company, industry, and sometimes the philosophy of the CIO or the executive team.
Well said. And I think you're right. It's not a one size fits all answer to that question. I think that's all, I often see organizations that, go into visibility. Everyone's like the TAM, the market size, everyone could use visibility. I'm going, well, let's bring that back down, because if you're a regional operation that bumps a dock 2 or 3 times a day, that is your metric. Do I need to see the transit at 150, 200 mile radius that's just milk runs all day? Probably not. So I'm with you. Like, I think organizations need to go like, what is our core mission here? And is good enough, truly good enough?
Right.
We know that tech has made some big claims, especially in the last years with the AI revolution. Has that all come to fruition? Absolutely not. Will it all come to fruition? I don't know. We'll see. But it's absolutely, the journey's been a lot longer than I think anyone anticipated across the board, right? So guys like you are the ones that we listen to kind of help us better understand how we may improve.
I think one of the challenges, you mentioned AI, so let's talk about sort of AI and, I don't know, routing or dispatch, that type of thing.
I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I think one of the challenges that companies are having there, first of all, as soon as AI became popular, everyone changed their marketing material to say AI. But I think, from the perspective of sort of a, practitioner who's actually sort of using the products or has a team that's using the products, number one, I think the first question you're going to get is, okay, now you're talking about AI, but I thought you were already using, Mr. Software Company, I thought you were already using advanced optimization techniques. Isn't that AI?
Right.
Like, what's the difference? Weren't you already using AI?
So what's the difference, James? Tell us.
Right.
You're an MIT grad. If anybody knows,
they have to tell us. They need to tell us.
Yeah. Fair.
I would say the other challenge is that, let's say AI, or machine learning are kind of looking at these patterns, over and over to kind of, I don't know, hone in on what sort of the true parameter is supposed to be, I guess, in the software. Let's say that works pretty well. How much is that really going to add to the optimal solution? And then beyond that, I mean, the number of routes that go exactly as planned every day, 50%, 60%. I mean, half your routes don't go according to plan anyway. So, over optimizing those to begin with isn't going to matter when the route sort of doesn't happen as you expected.
Sure.
So there's sort of the theoretical world and there's sort of the practical world. And I would like to hear more about, how AI ML is really going to impact things when, things go wrong in the field, right? You've got irregular operations. You've got, I go on ride-alongs probably a couple times a quarter.
What a valuable experience.
Time,
yeah.
Yeah. Every time there's something new, it's like, oh, I've never seen the customer do that before. Or,
AI, you need to fix this scenario, which is a complete anomaly. It's like, that's not going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not doubting that it can, on a theoretical level, it probably can help possibly a few percentage points. And if everything goes according to plan, it probably will help a little bit, but I don't know that it's really solving, anywhere in the sort of the top 5 or top 10 of issues or operational challenges that companies have when they're actually running an operation.
Again, I couldn't agree more. When you talk about the routing and you're talking about final mile, multi-stop, how do you know if you're actually is your routing the most efficient? Is it the best route? And you mentioned the ride along, which again, I commend James. I feel like more executives need to ride shotgun a little bit and see what it's really like. And probably some of the academics I work with that again live in a theoretical lab. Mm-hmm. And again, they're not wrong in theory.
Right.
But again, the application and the feasibility and just the way the physical world unfolds, to your earlier point, I'm sorry, this is just bring it back down to reality. So I'm curious, how do you what does that look like today in the planning process at your organization today? And what are there tools you're using today? Is it a lot of just tribal knowledge and just understanding at the end user level, the nuance involved there? They can interject, intervene, reconcile these things. Do you see that optimization software, for example, right? Is there a balancing act of trying to see what mathematically looks right versus the real world as it unfolds?
Right. And I think there's also a difference. We've talked about sort of home delivery and sort of Amazon routes before versus B2B routes where you're spending a lot of time with customers. And in addition, you've got, you're not necessarily trying to make only the most efficient route. As you mentioned, balance, Chris, you're trying to balance, say, cost with customer service,
That's
right? I mean, in the B2B world, well, especially in perishables, every customer wants their delivery before noon, right?
Yeah. As long as mine comes off first, we can do a multi-stop.
Right, exactly. So if you did that, you need to double your trucks and then things would be too expensive. So you got to make some trade-offs there. You're looking for cost-efficient routes, but at the same time, you've got to consider different customers. You've got to consider time windows. Oftentimes, depending on the industry, you got sales barking in your ear all the time. So I think you use the right word before, balance. Especially in my current role and with some other companies, in the B2B space. Now, if you're talking about something that, again, in perishables, a company like, QCD or even Penske that's got some of the Starbucks agreements, I believe, right?
Sure.
So, or even there was one out here. I don't know if they still have the contract for 7-Eleven. It was called Genesis in Southern California. That stuff's all happening overnight, right? Yeah. And you're not dealing with customers, and they've got they're basically key drops. They got the code. They're staging things in the store and that type of thing. Then you can be efficient again, even though it's a food and perishable customer. But if you're delivering during the day, during business hours, it's obviously a different thing, and you really need that balance. Cost with customer service, I think. Also with routes, balancing what the drivers are doing, right? You can't be giving one driver 12 hours a day and another one 3 hours a day, because you might even lose both of them.
That's right.
And then, talking about how have good routes, just looking at fleet utilization in general. You can either get that information from sometimes from the routing dispatch tool and sometimes from the telematics product. And We look at that at least monthly, which really doesn't sound like often enough, but and then you sort of look at the list and there's always a surprise at the bottom. Hey, why is this truck at 0% or 2%? The worst thing you can do is lose a trailer, right?
Yeah.
No one kept track of this. It's been, sitting on a lot in Kentucky for the last 6 months.
Don't want to smell the back of that trailer after a few days in the baking sun of Kentucky. Yeah.
But other times it's, hey, this unit's been in the shop and someone lost track of it.
Yeah.
Right. So someone call the shop right now and say, we want this thing fixed right now. Anyway, so really like sort of balancing between all those aspects we talked about and making sure your fleet's utilized. I think those are some things you can do to make sure that you've got good routes.
James, how do you reconcile that? You mentioned, we'll talk metrics for a brief moment. Within the organization, is utilization certainly a metric every organization focuses on as a KPI. But do you find that to get utilization, sometimes you have to sacrifice other key KPIs? So, from an optimization perspective, I use the word, what is optimal for you? And everyone's like, well, we want, is it profitability? Yeah. Revenue per asset. Yeah. Utilization, driver happiness. Well, look, you can't have your cake and eat it too always. So how do you reconcile when the higher ups maybe go, James, you run logistics here, seeing our utilization metrics down, but maybe that's, but our driver, there's a cost to recruit and train and retain drivers.
Right.
There's other metrics that, again, it's that spider web, right? If you pull on one part, the whole thing shifts. How do you go about trying to, communicate with your team and say, hey, no, it could be a moving target depending on the market and the time of year, seasonality, all that. How do you kind of engage in that conversation that when everybody wants everything, when they look to you for the answer, how do you respond?
Yeah, that is a great question. Ultimately it depends what the C-suite wants.
Always.
So it really doesn't matter who's barking in your ear. Yeah. I mean, they can bark in the C-suite's ear too. And the C-suite will get back to you, I guess. But, so there's different levels of metrics, right? So there's the metrics that sort of the C-suite cares about, especially maybe the CEO and the CFO, and that sort of can be tied in a way they understand into the very high level, company profitability metrics. And then there's more things that you use yourself, or within your team to make sure you're doing a good job and you're on track.
Yeah.
Some of the metrics that we use, if I was to talk about, say, the top, 3 to 5 metrics. So on a last mile basis, it's different than, line hauls, right? Where you're kind of looking at cost per mile, for example. You're really looking more at sort of, each stop or each pickup or delivery. So margin per drop is usually something that we look at. How much are we making to do a delivery to this customer, right? Or to pick up at this supplier. From a customer service standpoint, obviously on-time delivery.
Service. Yeah.
So, and if you have delivery windows, you can track, am I early, am I on time, or am I late?
Right.
Also, if I'm early, does that count as on time? Can I get by saying that's actually on time?
I think that used to be the case until Walmart introduced OTIF, which right. I think we realized that, late is late, early is late. Okay, so right. All right, that's our baseline. Okay.
Yeah, so that's definitely Walmart. Other ones are not quite as strict.
Yeah.
And certainly sort of independent shops are like
a little more flexible.
It's fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
Something else that we do, so obviously fill rates are talked about a lot in logistics.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's order fill rate. Hey, did we have the product in the warehouse and get it out the door? Well, there's also delivery fill rate. I mean, we had it on the truck. Did we deliver it to the customer? You'd be surprised how many times things are lost on the truck or they're misdelivered. Or, back to order fill rate, the customer ordered 3 of this and we only put 2 on the truck. So we measure something that I would call delivery fill rate as well.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah.
Other things, safety scores. Safety is super important.
You bet.
On the telematics side. So obviously there's been a lot of talk for several years now about the in-cab video cameras. The survey, I think, at least on the private truck side that I saw, was about 50-50 of companies carriers or fleets that are using the cameras, about 50% are forward facing only, and 50% are doing both ways, forward facing and towards the driver. We have both ways, so we've got good experience in that now. I can definitely vouch for having the camera facing the driver. Has both, from a safety standpoint, it's definitely caught a lot of behaviors that I think as employees and drivers, they know they shouldn't be doing. And our drivers are fantastic and do a great job every day on very dense delivery routes in very big cities. But, things like distracted driving, being on your phone when you're not supposed to be, that's against the rules. That's against good safety practice. We probably reduced, the occurrences of distracted driving 80 or 90%.
Yeah.
By having that video. In a couple cases, there's been very sort of unusual things that have been caught to, not privacy concerns, but really the distracted driving is the big thing. Driver not wearing its seatbelt. I think what they're calling AI in those systems, I think has been pretty good at saying, okay, is there a seatbelt or is there not a seatbelt? Okay.
Pretty binary. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's been good. I should say also the cameras have also caught, once in a while, a truck can be stolen.
Yeah.
And if the thief doesn't realize or doesn't care that the camera's in there, you really don't even need the camera. Just the fact you've got the telematics tracking the truck, you can figure out where your truck is. You can talk to the police and get your truck recovered more quickly. So that's been good. So yeah, safety, another big metric. And then finally, something that you see in some last mile operations, including ours, which is cross-docking. So
I was going to ask you about that
cross-docking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell us. I want to. I don't know that people. That's one of those areas that not every network utilizes a cross-dock, but there are many that do. And that's often where I see some of the breakdown occur, the miscommunications or things get lost in the shuffle. So yeah, give us a little more insight into at least your exposure into cross-dock operations and how that kind of ties into the broader, some of the similar discussion we're having.
Fantastic. So part of our model is, we sort of have our sort of main production and distribution facilities, and then we have cross-docks in various cities, which we sort of starburst, delivery routes, right? So out of the LA area, we've got one of our main distribution facilities. So every night the orders come in for cities that are, within say 500 miles of LA, whether it's the Bay Area, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Arizona, San Diego, cities like that. And then we'll fill the orders, and the first trucks that go out even before midnight are these line haul trucks where we're taking all the orders for Arizona over to Phoenix overnight. Yeah. We do a little bit of local production in Phoenix as well, but take the orders over, and then those are cross-docked at our Phoenix facility onto the delivery routes. So we might have 9 or 10 delivery routes in Arizona, say on a Thursday or Friday. Line haul comes in, those pallets are taken off the truck. They're already marked, as to which route they're going to. They're basically put right on the trucks. If it's a van, sometimes you got to break the pallets apart, but basically we want to get that product in the line haul and get that product out in the delivery route as quickly as we can. Yeah. So, that's what we've got going on in 9 or 10 cities, sort of that cross-docking. So, the question is, how quickly are you cross-docking, right? From the time the line haul truck comes in to, say the time the average route or the median route goes out. That's something we track as well. So ideally you want that to be no more than 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes if it's a busy day. Yeah. You don't want to see that be an hour and a half or 2 hours, because then you're starting to ask questions and what is going on there. You may have, drivers that are helping with the cross dock. Now they've been on shift for 2 or 3 hours, which cuts into their hours of service and their amount of time they can do deliveries. So, you really want things in and out of the cross dock as quickly as you can.
As you're talking, James, I'm just, again, as an optimization vendor, it all I'm in my mind, I'm going, and I'm sure that if I have my technical team, they're like sitting there trying to how to mathematically model all these things, which is great, right? Then they serve a whole different skill set than I have, and I'm very grateful to work with them. But when you think about all of the variables and data points, and well, we could talk about integrations and the access and accuracy of data that we do get it's maybe a different conversation. But what as an optimization vendor, what are things that we probably need to start really more deeply considering that we may not do today? And I'm not saying that's reflective of Optum, my organization. It could be just something that you would want the broader optimization community to be aware of.
I think it goes back to what we were saying before, sort of that theoretical versus practical. I would say don't assume it's just about the technology.
Yeah.
I mean, operations are very complex. They involve people, they involve culture, they involve sort of aspects that are definitely, apart from the technology or the software. So don't assume it's just about the software. And I say when you're selling or marketing it, again, keep in mind there's other factors that are going to sort of influence decisions and ways that potential customers thinking about how is this going to fit into my operations.
Yeah.
So definitely be sensitive to that. And I think thinking about the company culture and really the change management, right? I mean,
I was waiting for it. There it is.
Yeah, there's the culture and the people involved. If you want to have a successful implementation and have it be effective, for the customer, you really got to make sure that, you don't just sort of send a team and, hey, we've installed the technology in a month and we're gone. Right.
Yeah.
You really have to work to making sure that it sticks. Right. And some of it's on the company itself. And then some of it, or more of it, in my opinion, should be on the technology company. Now, oftentimes the technology company will partner with a consulting firm and they'll sort of do that piece. But I just think that's a very important piece that sometimes gets left out. I've seen plenty of, process changes or new systems that, may not have failed totally, but didn't go as planned or took much longer really to stick because of that culture and change management piece, and it's sort of not being managed effectively. So I think that's a really important point.
It never ceases to amaze me how little people seem to put into that change management and the repercussions of not making that really at the forefront of that deployment strategy. So I've lost count of how many times I'll be in a boardroom with executives that, they're all they hear is the metrics and the lowered OpEx. And I'm reporting to the streets, tomorrow I got my earnings call. It sounds great. Let's do it. And yet they never had a lot of that operational middle level down to the end user folks really be a part of that discussion, which I always think's a missed opportunity, a big one. And to your point earlier, often one that's filled with regret because we see that, there is as cool as technology is, it's only as good as the adoption rate it gets. And I think that's where it goes back. And this is kind of what it leads in my other question. I know we talked about AI and automation, which is all the rage these days. But we also have to remember there's the people aspect, right? The human capital. And James, when you're talking about maybe, procuring some new technologies that may have an augmentation or automation component, how do you talk to your teams and explain the why we're doing this, how we're doing this, how is it going to impact me? Because maybe I'm wrong, but I know that on a basic, human level, we're all feared of being made redundant by AI and machines. And I think now more than ever. Yeah. And that resistance to adopt technology, shame on the vendor for not being, and really executives too. I think it's a team effort. It takes a village through and through to get these projects successful. And again, I think I saw a stat at one point that in logistics in particular, I think it was like less than 2 to 3% of AI centric projects actually come to fruition. So how do you go about, again, internally? I know you have a tech mind, you're forward, but you've got to balance that out with the reality of those people in your team to make sure that they're on board and, again, explain the how and the why we're doing this. How do you go about that?
Well, I think the most important thing is to talk about how it affects the company and sort of the future of their jobs and customer service. Mm-hmm. I think when you relate it all to this is better for the customer, assuming it is, I think that type of argument works pretty well. I think people understand that the reason they have a job and the reason they're working for this business is ultimately about the customers.
That's right.
And making sure they do a good job for the customers, and the customers are happy, they're going to pay you, and everyone's going to continue having a job. So I think that's super important in sort of selling these types of things internally. I mean, part of it, if the decision's coming, say, from the C-suite, I mean, the company in some sense doesn't have a choice, right?
Yeah.
So there's always that
Well,
aspect.
don't you hate when it's a mandate, right? I'd rather be like a more of an embracing process versus
Yeah,
a band-aid.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of arguments you can use. I think having a strong organization and having people that you've hired or trained on your team that sort of buy into the same philosophy is important before you
Mm-hmm.
start doing any of this. And that makes it easier for them to sell it sort of downstream, and then their supervisors to sell it downstream as well.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, there's even the argument sometimes, and it's something that we made internally, with our drivers regarding the in-cab video is, hey guys, we're actually late to the game here. And if we want to be competitive, we've got to do the same thing as our competitors and other companies. And, with drivers, for example, when they do deliveries, they see other trucking companies, they see
Yeah.
other delivery carriers, and they talk with those drivers. And
Of course.
oftentimes they see that, that technology in use with the other guys. So it's not like it's sort of brand new or out of left field most of the time. Usually they've already heard about it or seen about it. That helps kind of pave the way as well. So, I think all those things together, I think you really have to kind of see a specific technology and kind of formulate your strategy for rolling it out. And I think it depends, but some of the factors that are involved, I think we talked about.
Yeah. James, if I get this question, so I want to get your take. Let's talk about, let's use Santa Monica, for example, seafoods. In the next, I say 3 to 5, maybe 7 years out, what does your office look like when you really look at technology, how it's evolving, where it really makes sense to adopt it, how it will presumably continue to gain traction and adoption? Is the future planning and dispatching and the final mile network, what does it look like? Again, we'll say 5 years as a median there. What's different in 5 years in your office than what it is today?
Well, some food distribution is not quite as technologically advanced as some other industries, or even on the transportation side. So I think there's still opportunities out there that don't even involve AI, right? Sort of getting more of the standards in place. Even things just involving basic scanning, end-to-end scanning in the supply chain, I think is an opportunity.
Yeah.
I am really hoping that we can go towards this sort of one platform, as I talked about before. Mm-hmm. That would be fantastic.
No right or wrong answers. And you've answered.
I can't think of what else.
Well, we'll talk. Well, that may be just from I get that a lot. It's on the spot, right? And it's kind of a lot of implications and applications and how I answer that. And I don't really have the crystal ball to tell you. I just say where I'm basing it on trajectory wise and where I see momentum going. But let's just take it. Let's zoom out a little bit within just the final mile sector. How does final mile operate perhaps differently in years to come than it does today? Or doesn't it? Maybe the answer is it won't. It'll just be tweaks here and there. I don't know.
Yeah. I think about, again, my current role. So as my company keeps expanding, we're rolling out the technologies we're already using well in current geographies to the new geographies. So there's obviously that. Mm-hmm. And what was the other part of your question, Chris?
No, I just wanted to know, like, when you look at where the evolution of final mile, that sector in particular, what it may look like in due time versus the way the operations typically work today. And I know you're going to put a spin on it because we're talking about, cold chain and food service, grocery delivery operations, all that. What changes in that?
Right. So I can think of a few things. I can't think of, I'm not sure I can think of sort of a unifying idea on the spot, but say on the telematics side, for example, I think a lot of that is going to become more OEM focused, right? So it's going to become part of the truck. It's not going to be, hey, we're putting on this unit in the box and this, we're going to plug in this unit. It's going to be part of come with the truck, right?
Yeah.
So I can see something like that. It's really going to be more about the software than the hardware. Every time I get animated about one of these things, I forget about the second thing that I was going to.
Well, listen, there's no right or wrong, very subjective. And maybe if I rephrase it and this is just, where would James Nissenberg like it to be? Where's the opportunity for, again, that this relative to your focus, what's the biggest opportunity for improvement, and how realistic is that? Again, this is just kind of spitballing here, but just trying to get absorb as much knowledge in your head as we can.
I think the single platform approach is good. I think just making sort of the software or the technologies more user friendly is always appreciated. Sometimes some of the routing software, for example, seems like it's very difficult to understand or train persons who don't have an education and that sort of thing.
Sure.
So I think those things are important. I also wanted to mention, I don't know if we were going to talk about this, but this is totally unrelated to the technology.
No worries.
Unrelated, but
semi-related. Named it for a reason that way.
That's right. Wow, that really okay, perfect. We didn't talk much about sustainability yet. Yeah. But especially starting with the state of California, it's really rolling out to other states as well. The whole issue with lower and lower emission trucks, and even to zero emission trucks, whether it's electric or some other energy, and everything around procuring that type of fleet and the infrastructure that has become a major focus, at least for carriers in California. So
100%, yeah.
If I didn't have that, I'd probably be focused a lot more on technology and sort of the big picture process improvement type things that I'd also like to do. But realistically, given the different mandates from the state and people's general interest, obviously improving air quality, and reducing emissions, that has become a very, very large focus on how do we manage that, right? I mean, whether you own a lot of trucks, whether you lease trucks, I mean, there's all sorts of calculations and costs that are involved. You can't just dump your whole fleet and get a whole new fleet. You don't have the cash for that. You've got leases that are terming out at different times. I mean, there's a whole strategy around dealing with that. That really in the next 10 years, I think is going to take up a lot of time for logistics executives, starting in California and then really in other states nationwide.
I'm super glad you brought up that sustainability. And again, no secret, California leading the charge there in every way. James, I mean, kind of on that, you mentioned, I mean, these are extremely costly endeavors to switch from a traditional fleet, right, over to more, at least I don't even know if we've really pinpointed the actual alternative fuel that makes the most sense yet, right? So I think there's highly contentious debates that go on around, BEVs versus hydrogen fuel cell versus renewable diesel, RNG, all that stuff, right? Right. As someone who's sitting in California, who's being basically, I mean, they're putting out, there's
operations nationwide. Because we got trucks. We have trucks in Chicago. We're going to have trucks in Baltimore soon.
Yeah.
And in other states, Arizona, Colorado. So,
do you have any thoughts on if you're sitting in a forum of a round table because you have a nationwide footprint and also being kind of, the California effect is real in terms of getting the catalyst for getting this across the rest of the lower 48. Do you have any take on what a best practice would be if you kind of have a voice in that conversation? No right or wrong answer.
Well, there's a lot that goes into it, Chris, obviously. So, I mean, in terms of general strategy of how do you manage your fleet during this transitionary period, that's a huge thing. We've reached out, some of the things we've sort of figured out internally, they're kind of intuitive. For example, don't sign a bunch of new, leases for diesel trucks that last for 10 years. So obviously we're not doing that. And, leases that term out where the mileage is low, maybe consider doing that year to year, right? Until more opportunities appear to purchase or lease zero emission vehicles. So those are some of the things we're doing. We're also working with our leasing companies a bit for support on that, because obviously they've got a large customer base.
You bet.
They're gaining more knowledge than we can on, sort of different strategies for this. So we're working with some of those guys. In terms of the specific alternative energy that's used, I don't really care.
Yeah. It's fair answer, right?
I don't have a stake whether it's electric or hydrogen. I don't really care. We just got to make the deliveries happen. We got to make make sure our customers are happy, and we got to make sure that the business does well.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're helping continue to reduce emissions,
Yeah.
and we all want that. But so, in terms of alternative energy, like I said, that's don't really have a stake in that. Very concerned about the ability for our infrastructure to support electricity in particular, increased electricity requirements. There's certainly a lot of companies here in California that have, torn up their yard and sort of, put in
charging stations. Yeah.
Sometimes it's more of a pilot. Hey, we're just doing in this facility, see how it works. We're still sort of at that stage, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I'm sort of holding out. So often what you see in terms of, fueling or diesel is what they call wet hosing, right? So basically the fuel company comes and refuels your fleet overnight, right?
Right.
They just sort of drive around your yard and fuel all the trucks. So I personally am hoping for more of a mobile solution. So let's say we're talking about having electric trucks, something that can come into your yard and, again, overnight. And this really pertains more to delivery fleets versus on the road. But they can go and do 4 or 6 trucks at a time. Say in 5 or 10 years, we've got super fast charging.
Yeah.
They can get it all done in 3 or 4 hours. I'm holding out for that. I'm not telling, our CEO, hey, let's talk to the landlord about ripping up our yard and putting in chargers yet. I want to see what's going to happen on the mobile standpoint. I feel like there's maybe still time for that.
I would agree.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear other people's perspective as well. But given how long it's taking and how, sort of the regulations and the cost with sort of ripping up infrastructure, oftentimes you don't even own, and 2 to 3 year wait.
Yeah.
I think people need to start looking for alternatives.
I'm with you. I think I look at consumer batteries, whether it's a cell phone charger or just, the AA, AAA batteries. I saw, social media always, entertaining us at a minimum, but seeing all the, whether it's these Meta founder, I think his company's called Spark Charge. He was on Shark Tank, the mobile charging, but more of a POV. And then you think about on a commercial vehicle size, just how much bigger those batteries, how much more weight they add, the charging time. Right. I saw one the other day that had like massive batteries. I use like electric, I'll do some yard work at some point this weekend. It's totally converted to electric everything. But the idea of, put a battery in the station. I bought 2 in case one is down. I can always have one available and swap them back. And I feel like there was a post, right, I think, and it looked like a cab where it had like, it looked like something you would just drop these massive batteries and then take the old ones out and charge them. So you constantly have this continuous movement and just replacing batteries. But just things that like, okay, that could make sense. But then I get into, you start looking at, you dig into it and you're like, wow, that's a massive lift for everyone to adapt. There's a cost to that. I don't know that the technology at any of this has really been proven enough at the technology itself. And even at the legislative and regulatory levels, the public trust on a lot of this is still the fire. Right. You see every time you think you're going down the right path and following Elon to Mars, you go, oh man, we didn't think about that.
A lot of times what you get from the regulatory agencies seems to be just do it.
Yeah. Right.
Here's a plan. I mean, it's not really a plan in my opinion half the time, but by 2035 or whichever date, I'm being honest.
Yeah.
You got to have X%, and we just hope. And we're going to force the technology to change. Sometimes it can't always change to that pace. It just can't.
Yes.
I think the motive is good in general, as long as we all agree that, there's something that really needs to be changed in terms of, emissions or even, carbon and that type of thing. But I don't know. I wish they would work together more with, with the OEMs and with with the companies that are involved to say what really is possible. How quickly can we really change this technology without raising costs so much that everyone's going to basically be in the poorhouse for 10 or 20 years until kind of this stabilizes. I don't know, because even with incentives, a new electric tractor, I think, is 3 or 4 times the cost of a new diesel one. And the diesel ones have gotten really good in reducing emissions. And I don't love diesel emissions. I mean, I've got kids and but that's just a fact of life. I mean, that's how things work right now. But, having the cost be 4 times, and maybe it comes down to just 2 times with all these incentives, which of course are not free. That's coming from taxpayer money.
That's right.
somehow. It's a lot. So
Yeah.
But we're going to follow. We're going to make the arguments we can, but we're going to ultimately follow the mandates that we have to, and get things done to to manage risk for the company and to do what we need to do legally and ethically. So
yeah, multifaceted conversation when it comes to these things. But the good news is, I think there has been a shift, called a generational shift of, the next gen. I have kids. We obviously want to have clean air and keep the environment as closest to healthy as we can make it. But yeah, I think we're running in the cost, right? We're running in a pretty razor thin margin business, at least on the transportation logistics side. And I think during the COVID boom, everybody's making money. I saw way more of an appetite to kind of explore these new technologies and alternative energies. And now with the market going in a complete opposite direction, I feel like I won't say it's been completely tabled, but now you're just seeing the priorities have shifted, right? So I'm hopeful that we'll hit an uptick in the market cycles, and that'll start to reinvigorate some of these conversations around topics we just discussed. So, well, James, let me ask you, what didn't I ask you today? I've had you for over an hour. I know it's Friday. You got a full-time job and a family and all that. So anything I didn't ask you that you think would be of importance for folks to know before we sign off?
No, I think I probably brought some things in that we didn't anticipate talking about. So I'm glad we got to talk about the sustainability aspect. So I think that was important. And, we talked a lot about last mile operations, particularly on the B2B side.
Yes.
Obviously, in my current role, we don't just do last mile operations. In fact, we don't just do them ourselves. We do a lot ourselves. We outsource to couriers and 3PLs, in some geographies or in some markets where we don't have as much penetration yet, and use a lot of carriers and brokers to do certain line hauls or deliveries to big grocery DCs, in addition to sort of the food service. But I think it was a tight conversation. I really appreciate it, Chris. It's actually been very exciting to talk to you, and great.
Love to have you back,
James. Great background.
I told Jacob he'll come back on in a minute on the marketing side, but my goal is, I love the one-on-ones. They're great, and every so often I like to think about some people that would be good on a panel that have exposure from various vantage points within these type of conversations to be able to kind of interject thoughts from their own perspective. So be on the lookout maybe for a follow-up and saying, hey, we'd like to get a diverse panel here. And I'm talking 2 or 3 other folks to kind of join in the discussion. But be on the lookout for that. And like I said, I think you'd be, just based on this conversation and just your background, I will definitely keep you in mind when this Future of Infrastructure Summit takes place, because these conversations are exactly what is being discussed, at least on my time there last year, which was my first time. But great to see, like I said, having various folks in the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, the feds, and then seeing the airport, the airport as an infrastructure facility of its own, talking about this is the needs we have, having technology folks come in there. It was a really diverse group, but I think it was great just to see, it enabled some really good conversations, fostered a lot of good networking. I'm hopeful that everybody left that with more to bring to the table next year, but I'll certainly keep you in mind, because I think you'd be able to add a lot to that conversation. So, with that,
sounds good.
You bet. With that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in here on Friday afternoon. Again, we'll be on the air again at some point soon with some more special guests and interesting conversations. So I want to again thank James Nissenberg for joining us today. James, how do people reach you if they have additional questions to ask you? Any preferred method?
I'm trying to figure out what information I give out, because, sometimes you're going to get about 100 sales emails.
Oh yeah. Well,
so I'm kind of worried about that, but
maybe just keep it like LinkedIn. LinkedIn's always
check me out on LinkedIn.
There you
James
go.
Nissenberg.
That's always the default answer.
I'm the only one out there.
There you
I'm
go.
the only one on earth with the name James Nissenberg. So
it makes it easy. Well, James, thanks again, man. Hope to. You've got me hungry, by the way. So I'm thinking about, when I associate seafood, which I'm a massive fan. I'm sitting there going to ask the missus maybe if we can go down to the local shop and maybe something you may have had a hand in getting to us here in Chicago. So, but again, thanks for the time, James. Again, thanks for everybody else for joining, and we'll see you guys soon.
All right. Thank you, Chris.
You bet.
Thanks, Optum.
You bet.